Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly look at news from around the world. This week, we'll take a look at China and what is happening in that country with COVID policies, declining economic policy, the challenge of Taiwan, and of course, a leadership election later in October. Then we'll see what is happening with regard to Russia. Vladimir Putin has escalated the conflict with Ukraine, a partial mobilization followed this morning by annexation of 4 provinces of Ukraine, about 20% of that territory, and a big gas leak that was connecting gas pipelines between Russia and Germany. And finally, protests in Iran. Young people in particular have taken to the streets. So far, the crackdown by the authorities is not as big as it could be, but is that something about to change? Here to talk about all of these issues this week are Bethany Allen-Ebrahimian, who's joining us from Taipei for the first time. She is the China reporter for Axios. Bethany, great to have you on the show.
Great to be here.
And from Brussels, Jamil Anderlini, editor-in-chief of Politico Europe. Jamil, great to have you back.
Thanks, Eva.
And from New York City, Bobby Ghosh, the columnist for Bloomberg Opinion. Bobby, wonderful to see you here as well.
Good to be back.
Bethany, let's start with you and what is happening in China. You're doing this from a very specific vantage point. Taipei, right across the water. You're looking at what's happening in that part of the world. We're seeing the world starting to take notice of China, and even as you wrote a week or so ago, Europe getting much, much tougher when it comes to thinking about China. But in general, how would you describe the fundamental problems that we have at the moment?
Yeah, so China right now, the situation that Chinese President Xi Jinping is facing is getting more and more serious domestically, and that's largely because of the economy, which to some extent is a self-inflicted wound. We have seen this, the zero COVID policy, which Xi himself has championed. He put his reputation behind that. He put, in fact, the reputation of China's political model behind that, to say China is superior than the West, superior than democracies. Look how we've kept our death rates so low. But with the super transmissible Omicron variant, it has just been impossible to keep COVID cases at zero without really drastic measures that have deeply harmed the economy. The World Bank just gave a new projection about the Chinese economy, saying that for the first time since 1990, China's economic growth rate is going to fall below that of the rest of Asia. This for the Chinese Communist Party, which has staked its model, its legitimacy, its place in the world on its ability to keep its growth rate up, I think is really very, very serious. That's not the only thing happening. In addition to that, there is this sort of slow motion train wreck of a real estate collapse, which people have been predicting for, literally decades, but at least years and years, because the model has been so inflated, so hot for so long. And it looks like finally, after so many years of the party, through policy, through subsidies, through government-backed infrastructure investment, has been basically kicking the can down the road for so long. It looks like that is finally catching up. So, a big slowdown in real estate, and that's something like 30% of China's GDP is somehow linked to the real estate sector. So this is 2 big things that are kind of colliding at once. And it couldn't come at a worse time, because next month, just a little bit more than 2 weeks from now, in fact, there's going to be the 20th Party Congress. Once every 5 years, the party's top leaders get together to select the leaders for the next 5 years, or to come to a consensus about that, and to select, choose economic direction. And what's so important this time is that Xi Jinping, who has been the general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party for 10 years, has been in charge of the country's government and its military for 10 years. He would, under normal circumstances, be stepping down now because he served 2 terms. But after he got rid of term limits 5 years ago, or three or 4 years ago, he's expected to take a 3rd term. And in order to do that, he needs to have consolidated his power and to have the supporters of the top party leaders behind him. and it's a bad time to have such an economic crisis. And just, briefly, the standing of China in at least the Western world has taken a huge hit. Even in the past year, it was already really starting to go downhill in 2020 with COVID. But since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, European nations, it seems to have really coalesced in a sense that China really is authoritarian, really is against many of Europe's interests, and that Europe really does need to stand together and with the US in pushing back against China in certain key areas.
It's a lot there, Bethany, that's going on, and Jamil, add to that or pick one of the issues that Bethany raised, and maybe look at it in this framework. There's a tendency of journalists and policymakers and people just to think about the future as an extension of the past. And it sort of looks like that's no longer the case when it comes to China. I saw, for example, a graph of relative growth rates between the United States and China, and China was supposed to overtake the United States, and that now may not happen. And there's this sense that maybe the next 40 years is not going to be the same as the last 40 years when it comes to China and the power that it has on the global stage. And we're on a sort of tipping point that China is actually, in some ways, becoming less significant. But that doesn't mean it will get any less dangerous, as we see in Russia, which is a declining power and seems to not be willing to accept that reality. So how do you read this moment in some ways?
Yeah, I think you made a very good point there, as did Bethany, of course, multiple very good points. That point about a declining power being far more dangerous than a rising power, that is exactly the point. I personally am in the camp, it's probably not the majority yet, but I'm personally in the camp that believes China's peaked and is in decline already. You see that in multiple areas, not least population decline, already peaked and already shrinking. And I think that's the most dangerous. It's there's too many analogies with World War I and et cetera. But if you think about Germany had already peaked and was worried that it had only this moment to sort of grab before it started sort of declining relative to the United Kingdom, for example. And I do think there's some similarities, and it's deeply worrying for me. I'm one of those people, Bethany, that was 12, 13, 14 years ago predicting the crash in the real estate market as a youngish reporter for the Financial Times in Beijing back then. I remember writing these stories like, ghost cities, this is going to crash, it can't last. And we are 10 years on. I knew I'd be right at some point. I hoped it would be sooner, but I do think, at the risk of being wrong again, I do think that even before these really serious lockdowns, you saw the collapse of Evergrande, one of the biggest real estate companies in the whole world. And you see the level of debt, which was always the thing that we looked at, is the level of debt financing versus what was being built. And the wonderful number, I actually am the first to ever report this number, by the way, but it was then picked up by many others, including Bill Gates and whoever. But in 2011 and 2012, in just 2 years, China poured more cement than the United States did in the entire 20th century. From 1900 to 2000, China in 2 years produced and poured more cement. I mean, so they were building, think about what America built using cement in the 20th century. It's the whole interstate highway system. It's New York, Chicago. It's the Hoover Dam, which is nothing. But, symbolism of what did America build in the 20th century? Quite a lot. China did that in 2 years. And that was the sort of thing we were looking at. And we were saying, it's all been financed by free money from the banks, never expected to be paid back. You cannot keep doing that. And they have for 10 years as Bethany pointed out, they've managed to kick the can. I think it's absolutely right. I'm here now in Brussels, and China's still kind of my calling card. So everyone wants to talk to me about China. And I think you're totally right, Bethany, that the shift that's happened here is it's a Zeitenwende, as they say in Germany, but not so much in Germany. It's happened across the rest of Europe. I think the Germans in particular are still kind of in denial when it comes to China because they are so reliant on the enormous Chinese market to sell cars in particular, but to sell machinery and to sell various things. So when I got here, my overwhelming feeling was it's a combination here, the attitude to China by Europeans, particularly Germans. It's a combination of naivety, ignorance, and greed. But I would add in now fear. So it's this weird combination. They're ignorant, China, it's a long way away, and they're not as scary as Russia or whatever. Naivety, like, and they're just kind of like us. We're all the same, and world peace is wonderful, and we are a superpower of values, and they should believe in our values, and isn't it great? And then like greed, like, oh my God, 1.4 billion customers isn't amazing. But the fear is what I think you're starting to see creep in with the war in Russia, China's support for that, and then the noises around Taiwan. The other things are still there, let's be clear, but particularly in Germany, as I said, or Hungary, or some of the less savory members of the European Union. But I do think you're right, that the mood is shifting. And ultimately, the European Union does stand for democracy and freedom and liberal values. And it ultimately would have to choose the side, in my opinion, of the United States.
So Bobby, that really raises sort of this analysis of this issue of a turning point. If in the United States in particular, and now in Europe, there's this sense of, oh my God, China's rising, it's so big, we need to counter it. It's happening at the same time that China, in fact, may not be rising, that it has reached its peak, that it is falling. Doesn't mean it's less dangerous. In fact, may become more dangerous. But what does that say about, what should be our long-term strategy? The long-term strategy was always bring China within the fold. That doesn't seem to have worked. How should we think about the strategy going forward, if indeed, assuming you do agree, that it's at or near or past its peak?
I do tend to agree that it is past its peak, although I think the decline will not be sharp. Let's hope not, because there are enormous consequences for the global economy. I think the fact that China is peaking, the fact that it's going to have to spend a few years now tending to its self-inflicted wounds on its own economy, on its own domestic constituency, that housing crisis that both Bethany and we were talking about. I'm curious about, and I'm trying to read into how that plays out, not just in the US, but in the parts of the world that I cover. So Middle East, Africa, Turkey. All of these places have spent the last 15, 20 years riding, if you like, on China's success and benefiting from it in many, many ways, including investment from China, including hedging, using China as a hedge against the West, and using, particularly with the more authoritarian regimes in the part of the world, using China as as leverage with the West. And as China is less able to provide that hedge, provide that kind of funding and that kind of support, I'd be curious to see how those regimes respond. This is an opportunity for the US to reclaim some of the lost ground in those countries. I think successive American presidencies from Obama onwards have been a little bit sleeping at the wheel, particularly in Africa. Lots of hand-wringing, as you know, Ivo, in Washington about, the Chinese are stealing a march over us in Africa, but not very much action there. It's an opportunity to basically herd the cats back into the fold. I'm sorry, I'm mangling my metaphors there. But yeah, as we become more watchful about China, as we become more alert to the potential danger of China, as James mentioned, we need to be able to regroup the international consensus, bring back into the Western fold, the American fold, the democratic fold, countries that have been playing various degrees of footsie with Beijing. So that includes the Philippines. President Marcos was here recently, and some interesting tea leaves to be read there. But all over the Middle East, all over Africa, all over Latin America, I think a lot of countries that were depending on China for one reason or the other, economically or geopolitically, will have to make fresh calculations, which presents an opportunity for the US, for Europe.
Big question, of course. Go ahead, Jamil.
Sorry, just a quick subsidiary point. So I went and briefed some ambassadors and diplomats this morning, and I, not knowing that much about Europe, I had to ask my colleagues what was the big thing they might want to talk about or what they're interested in. And it was fascinating because what they described was a Europe that wants to talk with the US in particular bilaterally about a bunch of things like electric vehicles and technology companies and Orca, there's a bunch of things that they want to sort of get. And what they say, the Europeans say, not necessarily in the earshot of the Americans, is all the Americans want to talk about is China. And we're fed up and we're sick of talking about China. Yes, there has been this change here, but they are so fed up of being pushed and pushed and pushed by America. And that was quite interesting for me. And the US is doing that not just in Europe, they're doing it everywhere. It's like, oh, China's really, really bad and you have to work with us. But in a lot of places, I think to Bobby's point, I don't think they're not quite winning that argument. You know what I mean? There's a lot of places that are like, well, you guys are the really imperialist ones, and China just comes and gives us lots of money, and it's great, and bribes, and it's awesome. And I just wanted to add that point.
Right. No, and in some ways, I mean, what I hear from those countries is, well, the Chinese are at least investing in us, and you're doing nothing. To Bobby's point, and if you want to have influence, maybe it's time that you actually, help deal with our problems rather than saying you can't be with the Chinese. We still need to develop. We still need to build, highways and rail transportation, and the Chinese are doing that. Final point on Bethany, to you, since you have this unique vantage point of being in Taipei. We talked about the decline of China in some ways, but if you're sitting in Taipei, whether it's decline or rise is really not necessarily the pertinent point. You've been there for a few months. Doesn't mean you know exactly what's going on, but you know a lot more than we do. How does Taiwan look at this particular moment of China, and how they look at the next few years?
Let me tell you, from Taiwan, China does not appear to be declining. That's not the pertinent data point to look at, because from a Taiwanese perspective, what they're experiencing is a dramatically more aggressive China, and that predates Pelosi's visit. Like, to be clear, it's been a gradual rationing up really since 2016, but the past year, just militarily, the saber rattling from China, the daily incursions into Taiwan's, air defense identification zones, planes crossing the midlines. I mean, just more and more and more things. So much more pressure on Taiwan across, diplomatically, militarily, economically, and what seems to be we don't have a date. Xi Jinping hasn't set a date, but it seems to, the way he talks about Taiwan, it seems as though this is going to be something he wants to do while he's in power, like in his lifetime. And there's a huge amount of concern here that after the 2040 Congress, that Xi Jinping will have his power consolidated. There will no longer be anyone who can thwart him or stop him. He'll have 5 years to do what he wants, and that 5 years, I think a lot of the Taiwanese people in the government who think about this, the average people, just sort of the daily Taiwanese people, don't really think about this very much, as much as I think they should. But for people whose job it is to worry about this, they're really, really concerned. Depending on who you talk to, some people say within 5 years, within 3 years, China will make some kind of attempt. And what we are seeing in Taiwan, I think really for the first time in, democratic Taiwanese history, is at the beginning, the start of a civil mobilization. And I have been, doing a lot of on the ground reporting on this, looking at these new organizations that are being founded to do, to basically create civil militias and to do, civil defense training and to do civil cyber defense training. So it feels here like a pressure cooker that's getting hotter and hotter. When when you said, I think several of you have said that when you have a power that seems maybe it's worried it's kind of reached its peak and it's declining, that's the dangerous point. I'm sitting in the dangerous point. It's a location and it's right here, and it feels that way.
Thanks for that reflection, because it is, an on the ground perspective. It really does help to we can talk about the big trends, but the reality is felt in the places on the ground. We'll come back to this many times in future editions, but let's move on to another set of issues that are trying and have just exploded over the past week in the gas pipeline. The Nord Stream pipeline literally exploded, but it does have a sense that Vladimir Putin is in a very, very deep hole, and has decided that the best thing he'd do is to bring out the bulldozers and start deeping even deeper. A lot of things happening this week with regard of mobilization, which is creating all kinds of problems domestically. Of course, the sabotaging of Nord Stream 1 and 2, which everyone now agrees was a sabotage act and not an accident. Whether the Russians were behind it or not is still TBD. Nuclear threats, and of course, this morning, annexation of 4 oblasts to 4 provinces, the size of Portugal, without any legality or anything else, and none of it seems to be helping Vladimir Putin in what he's trying to do. But Jamil, the EU has been meeting on this. The US has already announced new sanctions. The EU is about to do so. The same thing. How do you see Putin and what he's, how is he trying to get out of the box that he has sealed himself in? To mix metaphors there.
Yeah, I just watched the press conference that he gave live about an hour or so ago, and we were watching that. Big breaking story, obviously, and it was astonishing. I mean, the bit I heard, the thing that really jumped out was he was like, first the West sanctioned us, led by America, sanctioned us, and now they are carrying out terrorist acts by blowing up these pipelines. So, that we have a maxim, never believe anything till the Kremlin denies it. Now it's like, okay, it's definitely the Russians. Like the fact that they're now directly blaming, not raising questions or asking questions. It's now like the West did it. The people I talk to here, they're certain it's the Russians. They don't want to all go on the record, but they're close to going on the record, and they will. I think in the next few days, Western intelligence agents, U.S. intelligence officials will come out and say, "Here's the evidence. This is why it was Moscow." But the fascinating thing for me is how many people, and not just the people we call the tankies, the sort of uber leftists who support authoritarian right-wing fascist regimes. A lot of people saying, well, maybe it was the CIA, maybe America had most to gain from something like this. Maybe the Americans gave the Ukrainians some underwater things so that they could do it because Germany's really a bit mushy and they might have wavered, and now they can't buy gas from Russia. Now they're going to definitely send the tanks. You can see this narrative building. A lot of it's probably disinformation, misinformation, whatever. But there's a lot of people in Europe, particularly on the far left and the far right, who want to blame America for this and say this is a CIA operation. Of course it is. Certainly, we've discussed it even, we have to, as good journalists, we have to interrogate every line of questioning, and we've really done some good reporting. And by all accounts, from what we can tell, it was Russia. But, obviously we weren't there and we can't dive down. But I think what we'll see in the next few weeks, as with most Russian sort of disinformation operations, we'll find evidence and it'll be clear, yes, Russia did it. And one of the more interesting discussions I had with someone pretty qualified to talk on this topic, their optimistic take was, this is Putin, typical textbook Putin. He's escalating to de-escalate, and this is a good thing. What he's doing is he's mobilized, he's blown up the pipelines, and now he's coming to the table to negotiate. And that's sort of, I think, the dream of the Germans and probably the French and maybe the Italians now, and definitely Viktor Orban and a lot of Europeans. The dream is, okay, he's going to come with something. It'll be reasonable enough. He'll take half of the 4 oblasts. Okay, he's nationalizing, but he'll redefine their borders, and he'll freeze it where he is. Frozen conflict. We can take that. Now, let's stop the silly war and turn the gas. Can't turn it on through Nord Stream, but let's get some oil going, and let's I do still think, Western Europe, not in the Baltic region, not in Poland, not in places closer to Russia, but in the western part of Europe, there's a real desire to like, hey, we're not going to win this. We don't want to be incinerated in nuclear war. Guys, let's negotiate. So he might be successful with this, escalate to de-escalate. And now the pressure comes on Zelensky. Make a deal. Stop dying for nothing.
Bobby, you think the pressure is on Zelensky to make the deal, or do you think the pressure is on Putin, who sees, in a week, 200,000 young men leaving the country, increasing protests throughout the country on the mobilization, and the reality that none of these people mobilized will actually make much of a difference when it comes to actually fighting this war? So last time I looked, fighting wars with people who are untrained and unwilling to fight is not a recipe for winning.
No, and the gas explosions, the sabotage of the pipeline sort of changed the conversation, which I'm not suggesting that was the main motive for it, but certainly convenient from Moscow's point of view that that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about the sort of mishandling of the mobilization itself, and of these referendums. And I like Jamil was watching the press conference earlier today, the statement from Putin, and it was unhinged even by his standards. I mean, he's accusing the Anglo-Saxons of blowing up the pipeline. I mean, what, the Vikings were not available, or the Picts, or the Dukes? It was really quite unhinged, and it left me sort of nervous about what he might do next. I don't know. I think there was much more pressure on the Ukrainians maybe 4 weeks ago, before they'd made those big advances militarily. I think that deflected some of that pressure because the Ukrainians were able to demonstrate that they were actually having some success on the battlefield, and that they were killing more Russians than Ukrainians were being killed. Will pressure come back on the Ukrainians? I suspect so, but I think Zelensky knows it's coming and will have an argument against it ready, locked and loaded. The pressure on Russia, I don't know. The pressure on Russia has to come from within. I don't know that Putin is in any, not that he ever was, but I think at this stage, I don't think he's paying much attention to any pressure from the outside. Let's remind ourselves that that the mobilization, the referendums, and the gas pipeline explosions, all these happen after Putin comes back from Samarkand, where the two people whose opinions he might just care about put pressure on him: Xi Jinping of China, Narendra Modi of India. They both, in diplomatic terms, chided him. And he came back from that, and far from moderating his position, he seems to have ratcheted up, both rhetorically and militarily, and in any way, every way, politically, ratcheted up his sort of what's the right word? Aggression. And so I don't know whether there's much more pressure that can be applied. There will be sanctions, but we know that Putin and his inner circle of people don't really feel the effect of those sanctions. The one piece I thought was interesting today, and I'd be curious to hear particularly from Jamil on this, is what to make of the fact that he seemed to acknowledge that the mobilization had gone bad. He referred to mistakes, and said those mistakes would be corrected. Now, any other leader says that, it's just rhetorical. But coming from Putin, who will, does not admit to any kind of weakness, it seemed sort of interesting to me, and I'd be curious to know.
He said the same yesterday. He's now said it 2 days in a row. Yeah.
Yes. My take on that would be he's not saying it's his mistake. He's saying it's the mistake of some governors. Because remember, the mobilization is not centralized. You've got these quotas sent down to all of and particularly, I would say one of the most disgusting things I've seen, and we've been looking at it very closely, and we reported a little, but we're planning to report a lot more. The burden of the mobilization seems to fall very, very, very heavily on ethnic minorities, the Tuva people and the Tatars, and so what's fascinating for us, and we're looking at it more broadly, but he seems to be also, as part of this whole holy war that he's got going on, trying to cleanse the Great Rus of the undesirables, in his opinion. I mean, it's sort of disgusting how racial, the racial element to this. And some of the videos of some of these ethnic minorities in the more remote parts of Russia, it's not just like you might see in the US where it's farm boys from Alabama or like kids from poor neighborhoods. It's actually literally like you're being chosen based on they're the expendable minorities. I think it's really horrible. But my point is, I think he's saying you've made mistakes and now you're going to be punished. So I don't be surprised if you get a bunch of regional governors jumping out, falling out of windows or whatever they do these days.
I mean, it does raise this, it means that the mobilization is not going to help in terms of the actual military effort, which presumably is what mobilization is about. But Bethany, two questions for you. One, Bobby rightly mentioned that the conversation that Putin had with Xi Jinping in at the time of the SCO meeting, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, didn't go the way Putin wanted to. And if you have any insight on what it is that Xi may have told him, that'd be great. And secondly, to what extent is this a cautionary tale for Xi Jinping? I mean, Ukraine is a lot closer to Russia than Taiwan is to the mainland. There's no water in between. And everyone thought this was going to be a cakewalk. Certainly the Russians did. I assume the Chinese did. The Russian equipment ain't working very well. And last I looked, it's the Chinese who are buying it. How are they looking at this as a cautionary tale or saying, oh, no, they are just not very capable and we're much more capable, so it won't apply to us? How are they reading the lesson?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, in 2022, Xi Jinping having a bad year, for zero COVID and the economy and stuff, this is also just like a terrible thing for him. Like, it could have been okay. If Putin had invaded Ukraine and like won easily, that would have been like totally great for Xi Jinping. But it's just, you can just, sort of see Xi Jinping at night being like, oh, damn it. Why, like, what's going on? Like, why is everything falling apart? This is like a disaster for Xi Jinping. The way that his not an ally, but a partnership without limits has just gotten into this total morass. And I'm sure that Xi Jinping is not happy with that. But I personally think that the remarks that were credited to Xi Jinping saying like, well, I guess it was Wang Yi or someone saying that like, conveyed concerns about something, just the concerns. I personally think that has been really overplayed. I think that was messaging to the West. What did he actually say to Putin? I don't know. Nobody knows. But that was messaging to the West because that is what we wanted to hear. We wanted something that would make us feel less worried about this partnership. And I don't buy it. From what we're seeing from China, even though I don't think that Xi Jinping is happy about how things are going out, but we know from long experience now that he thinks long-term, and he clearly thinks that maybe in the short term, this is damaging China's reputation in Europe. But in the long run, the way that Putin has just kind of thrown a wrench in the cogs of everything, it could easily 5 years, 10 years from now play well into Xi's hands if things become quite chaotic in Europe. Just here's a very specific, clear point. The Biden administration has been pushing the Taiwanese military to buy Stinger missiles, and Javelin and stuff that are for asymmetric defensive war. However, the U.S. is sending much of its supply and its ability to produce that to Ukraine, and it does not have the Stinger missiles in stock to send to Taiwan right now. That's great for China. A lot of U.S. energy has been put towards this, and we talk about Taiwan learning from Ukraine, but China has also been learning a ton. A lot of don't do this in terms of the West. I mean, the big shock in the beginning was how unified the West was in the response to Putin's invasion, and I think Xi Jinping has learned from that. I don't think he's been like, oh, I guess it better not invade Taiwan. That's not what he's doing. He's learning from this, looking for the cracks that he could further take advantage of, and looking for the weaknesses and looking for the right things to do. So, I think that it's a learning opportunity for him. And who's to say how things will look in 5 to 10 years? And just to sort of cap that off, I also would warn about overplaying China peaking. I mean, in 10 years, what we're seeing right now in 2022 could be a blip. Really, really, it could. And I think about, one time I heard Fareed Zakaria give a talk, and he said, this was in 2011 or 2012, and he said, "Is the U.S. in decline?" Well, in the 1970s, people were saying the U.S. was in decline. In the 1980s, people were saying the U.S. is in decline. Every decade, people say the U.S. is in decline. I would say we have there's a similar sort of knee-jerk thing about China too. Well, this will be the moment that the Chinese Communist Party collapses or whatever. I mean, I think that China is very, very resilient. Its political system is very resilient. Its economy is, I'm sure, very resilient. So it's, I would say I would err on the side of optimism if, from a perspective from Beijing.
I mean, one point, it's since we were talking about slightly tangential, but not entirely. I'm very curious about how China views what's happened in the Baltic Sea, these the sabotage of those pipelines. If Putin is counting on China to be a major buyer of Russian gas, and if China is interested in being a major buyer of Russian gas, how are the Chinese viewing this kind of self-destruction, the reliability of Russia, the reliability of Putin as a partner, if he's willing to blow up, as we believe he has done, blow up these multi-billion-dollar pipelines to Germany? I wonder how this is playing out in Beijing.
Well, one way to think about it is there's only one other place to start shipping it to is building new pipelines to China, so it may help.
Which they've been doing for years,
and that's that's what. But yes, this guy is a pretty unpredictable partner to have without limits. And Bethany, I think you're warning not to overestimate where we are. It's only in hindsight that we really know what's happening. But and we will be going back to peak, no peak. There's plenty of evidence on both sides, which is usually why it is difficult to predict the future. As Yogi Berra said, it's hard. It's prediction is hard, especially about the future. So that applies to China as well. Bobby, in the few minutes we have left, really the story that seems to sort of disappearing a little bit, although it shouldn't, because it's really a big one. Are the protests in Iran, and it's a different. It has a different feel about it because it's more younger people and it's led by women than some of the earlier protests, including the big one in 2009 in the Green Revolution in response to the stolen election. And it also seems that the reaction in countries in the European Union and the United States is a little less holding back and more willing to support what's going on, an effort to maintain the capacity of the protest. Where are we today? How should we look at this? And what you, again, predicting is hard, especially about the future. But how do you see this evolving?
Well, you made the right. You as you pointed out, this is primarily young people and women. The young people part of it is very important. The women part is getting a lot of attention, but the young people part is very important. This is Iran's Gen Z. These are people who not only were not born during the revolution of '79, but have no experience of the Iran-Iraq war, and therefore the regime's credibility, if you like, the regime's reason to exist, the revolution as well as the Iran-Iraq war, that doesn't cut much ice with these young people. These people are not going to be persuaded by the regime's invocation of previous incidents of which they have no living experience. That's very important. It is significant that even in the middle of this crisis with Ukraine and Russia, that the international community has taken note of it. When in 2009, I don't think the Obama administration covered itself with glory in its response to both the revolution, both the Green Movement and the crackdown. But Biden mentioned it in his speech in the United Nations. The State Department has been referring to it almost every day. Sanctions have been announced. So the world is paying attention. And a big difference from 2009 is that, of course, we are a far more social media world than we used to be. And these young people, being as they are young people, are very good at circumventing the government's attempts to block channels, block communications, and getting the word out, getting the videos out, and so on. So the world is paying attention. This is very, very important. But that having been said, what those young people need next is for another big domestic constituency to fall in behind them. If we, all comparisons are odious. If you remember the Arab Spring the Arab Spring uprisings, the dam broke when the militaries in Tunisia and in Egypt refused to shoot upon the protesters and in effect back the protest against the regime. In Tunisia, there was the additional dimension of the big unions that basically supported the uprising, and that forced the regime to go. Something like that needs to happen in Iran. And as yet, we are not seeing enough to be optimistic about that happening. The young people have been incredibly brave. They're now entering their third week of these protests. They're still out there. They're braving bullets and batons. But on the other side, neither has the regime brought out its biggest guns. The IRGC is not out in full force in the streets of Iranian cities as they were in 2009 and 2019. The regime is still primarily using the police and to some degree paramilitaries to try and make this crackdown successful. So what needs to happen, something's got to give. What's got to give, I think, is that other domestic constituencies, encouraged by, inspired by the sheer stamina of these young people, need to come out in support of these protests. If that doesn't happen, then I feel we might see a situation akin to Iraq or Lebanon, where young people come out from time to time and express their deep unhappiness with what's going on, but are not actually able to move the needle. And I'd hate to see that happen. I hope that doesn't happen, but it could be that.
Bethany? Yeah.
Can I add on to that? So I was in Iran in early 2018, in January 2018, when that big protest, when there were all those protests across Iran. And I can add just a few comparisons as well. At that time, I think there were several problems with that movement and the reason it didn't last. And one of them is that it wasn't a movement. It was lots of things. It was kind of like Occupy Wall Street, in that it was just a bunch of people being like, I'm angry about something, but it was a bunch of people angry about different stuff. And it was also leaderless, really. It wasn't the reformists. There was no political structure behind it to back it. It was just a bunch of angry people, angry about the economy, angry about the political system. And so there was no power behind it. This time there is one issue. Now it's a one issue that's sort of symbolic for many other issues, but at least there's one issue, and there is a unifying figure, although she is dead, so she's not leading it. So there are some differences here that give some sense that this may have a longer term impact than
Seller in Tunisia type of thing.
Yeah. There's that for it, and the messaging is very clear. This time. I mean, what were the 2018 protests about? The economy? I don't know. Nobody knows because it was too much. But I do think that, at least just sort of anecdotally, it seems to me like the regime is tamping down longer on social media. On the internet, it's hard. The protest, because I was there. It was basically 3 days of a blacked out internet, and then they lifted it. And now it's. I think they're holding it longer. So I don't know. It's interesting to see how things may turn out.
Well, and Jamil, a lot of things are also two other elements. One is on the social media stuff. We learned from Ukraine that Starlink, the Elon Musk satellite system, can, if you have the equipment on the ground, sort of circumvent whatever's happening officially. Now, that's a big that's a big bet, and the U.S. government is open up the possibility to see, is there an alternative internet to the one that the Iranian government has, and of course what's been blacked out. And then secondly, this protest is taking place when there's a possibility of a succession crisis, because of course the Ayatollah, the supreme leader, his health is problematical. Give you 30 seconds to either comment on that or where you see this going and how the Europeans are looking at it.
I mean, Europe is still, from what I can tell, still kind of stuck back in the JCPOA. They're still like hopeful we're going to have a deal. It's this deal that they care so much about, that they feel they were so instrumental, that's been long dead and is probably never coming back. But I think it's fascinating. I get contacted here all the time by random Iranian groups who are all over Europe, of course, and the Mujahideen, the real opposition. These groups are, some of them, kind of crazy, and the noise from them is really ramping up. They have real deep contacts in the country, and they are saying this is for real, and this is blowing out, and it could get much worse. And but the European governments, just with Ukraine, with the coming winter of discontent, they don't want to talk about it. They don't want to think about it. It's like another problem. We just want it to go away. There's a bit of that, certainly in Brussels, at least.
Well, my sense is it won't go away. Hopefully, it won't go away because the protest can continue and gain momentum. But if not, it won't go away because of the crackdown will be extraordinary to silence these voices. Let's hope for the best. I want to thank Jamil Anderlini, Bethany Allen-Ebrahimian, and Bobby Ghosh for a really insightful look at some of the big issues that we had this week. We'll begin back next week with another edition of World Review. Until then, bon weekend.